Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of our Accolade tutorial. Today we'll be talking about how you can now use Accolade and Accolade Studio to verify your data model against a set of predefined rules. That's exactly what model verification entails. We're going to try and verify the consistency and the quality of our data models by verifying the contents of those models against two things. One, being a glossary of class and prime terms, and two, a set of target-specific attribute rules that verify, for example, the precision or the scale of numeric attributes, or, for example, the length of string attributes. This is going to be applied to the business names, right, for non-target specific glossary-based rules, and to the technical names for target-specific and attribute-based rules. Let's explore that a little bit more. So first of all, for the business names that we are going to be verifying here, we should understand that these are actually expressions that are describing a single data object. And every one of these expressions is going to consist of a number of different terms that can be categorized in three different categories. The first category is what we call a class term. This is the highest level of classification where we basically put the different expressions that we find in a data object into a particular class. So typically this would be the last word of the business name. But it might also be a phrase. It might be something like unit of measure, for example. This is something that defines the class of the expression of the data object that we are trying to verify. And it typically identifies the general purpose of the data object. Then, in order to make it a little bit more specific, we will use prime terms. Prime terms are the most important modifier of the class term. Right? It's typically a single word, or it might also be a phrase, like unit of measure. It directly precedes the class term. And then, thirdly, we will have modifying terms. Right? Modifying terms that add important business information to the data object and that precede the prime term. Now, it's important to understand that when we do model verification in Accolade Studio, we are going to cover prime and class terms. We are going to ignore all of the modifiers, all of the modifying terms that are not declared as class terms. And the reason why we do that is because otherwise we would just get a crazy multiplication of different possibilities that will become impossible to work with. Now let's look at a specific example to make this a little bit clearer. Right? So for example, we have a data object that is concerned with a currency code. And as you can see here, it's color-coded. The code, this is the main classification that we are working with here. Then we have a prime term that basically explains that we're not talking about any type of code, we're talking about a currency code. And we are going to apply all of our model verifications to these two terms, to currency code. All of the other modifying terms, the orange bits that we have here, component invoice amount, currency code, component total amount, currency code, unit price, currency code. All of these different modifying terms are not going to be considered in our model verification. We are going to do the model verification based on the rules that apply to currency code. Therefore, it should be clear that there's a lot of possible combinations here. There's a lot of possible interdependencies between the different rules that you're going to specify. And therefore, we recommend that you experiment with a small glossary first. You will see the complexity, you will see the outcome of the model verification very, very quickly, and then make it more sophisticated as you go along. Right, so the glossary verifications will check the business names in the model with the terms in the glossary file. That glossary file is an extension of the existing abbreviations file that we may already have used in our naming conventions. Right, so it essentially adds another column, the synonyms that are to be prevented. Right, multiple synonyms might be separated by a pipe character. Unlike naming conventions, this file is the same for all targets, right? And terms are checked for each and every object in our model. So when we run the glossary verifications, you will find that there are three different rules that are currently checked, right? So the validity of the term, right? If the business name contains terms that are not in the glossary, it will be considered an invalid term. Inconsistent terms, right? So a combination of prime and class terms that are not in the glossary. And then synonyms, business names that contain synonyms of glossary terms, right? If the rules are not respected, it will create an entry in the verification report, which we will look at a little bit later, right? So the glossary verification will generate a verification report. Then we can start looking at the second type of model verification that Hackerlate offers, which are attribute verifications. These verifications are specific to the plugin that you are using at this particular time in this particular model. So it will check the technical or the business names against user-defined properties and user-defined property rules that are in a target-specific file. Right? So the technical names are optional, and potentially it might be using naming conventions. Using this file, we're going to verify the technical name, whether or not it's required, the default value, the data type, the length, the precision, and the scale of a particular data object. We will also check that the attribute matches the specification in this file and generate report entries for problems against that validation. We will also check additional rules in that file, right? For example, if a technical name conflicts with the keywords, or if there's an excessive technical name length, all of these things are checked, right? And we might create proactive warnings for duplicate table names in the same schema, duplicate couple names in the same table, dangling relationships, mismatched data types in relationships. All of these types of things are validated. In order to use the model verification, and we will see this later on during our little demo here, you will obviously have to configure the paths, right? Where are you going to store the glossary file? Where is it going to pick up the attribute verification files? Where should it generate the model reports? And then it will allow you to run this, and you can specifically choose which rules you would want to have included in the report and what type of report or error should be created when an invalid entry is found. It will generate a CSV file, right, which you can then open in your favorite spreadsheet. It looks a little bit like this. You can, look at this in different ways, either in your code editor or in the spreadsheet or whatever, right? And then you can start the interpretation of that exception report, obviously. Note that this report can be quite long. So therefore, our recommendation would be that you run this validation report iteratively. Right, and start with the highest priority exceptions and then see what comes out, what errors are reported. And the reason why we say this is that we also know that some rules will depend on other rules. You will get a cascade of entries in the report, and it may just be, one particular problem that is causing a cascade of other problems. Because, if you have multiple rules that are being failed, that will generate multiple lines in the report. You might want to hide some specific GUIDs from the report. That's really easy, or group some columns for easier interpretation. Great. Let's now take a look at how this looks in practice in a short little demo. All right, let's jump right in. I'll be illustrating this model verification here using a data model that I've used before. It's a MongoDB data model of the Northwind database, the denormalized version of it, as you can tell over here, right? The orders have been denormalized over here into a nested structure. And what I'll be doing here is I'm going to be working with a very similar file to the one that we have used before in the naming conventions tutorial, right? In the naming conventions tutorial, we had a CSV file, right, that looked like this one, right? We had a business name, a technical name, and an optional description, right? And you would have a linking between the business name and the technical name that was automated through the naming conventions. Well, in the model verification functionality, we're going to be working with two files. One is the model glossary verification file, and then the other one is the model attribute verification file, right? So the model glossary verification file is actually an extension of the naming conventions file. Here you have three columns, right? Business name, technical name, and optional description. In the model glossary verification, we actually have four columns: a business name, technical name, description, and here on the side we have what we call the synonyms, right, which is where we will link these combinations of business technical name to potential synonyms. The example that I'll be using here is the email example, right? So email business name is spelled like this, the technical name is spelled like that, and there's a bunch of potential synonyms that we would want to verify the model against from this glossary. And then the second file that I'll be using is this one over here, where I have a set of rules, of what the attributes with a specific technical name would want to comply with, right? So email, in this particular case, would need to be a string of length 100, right? And the model verification functionality is going to check that when I apply this particular file. Now you've got a view of the setup. Let's go over here in my Northwind model. And what I'll do here is I'll actually add a property here, right, which is going to be an email property for employees, right? You have the business name, which is capitalized, and the technical name automatically decapitalized, right? And this is a string, right, with a particular format, right? And I'm actually going to give it a minimum and maximum length of 100 in line with what we have specified in our verifications file, right? But for our customers over here, I'm going to also introduce a new property, right, which I'm also going to call email, right? But I'm actually going to misassign its data type, right? I'm going to have this as a numeric data type, right, which is obviously wrong, but I'm trying to simulate what the model verification would look like. What we'll do now is we'll go into tools, right, and say verify the data model. And obviously here the recommendation is that we do this step by step, right, that we don't do this in one big go, but for example, we create a verification report for the glossary first and then for the fields afterwards, right? So you can select this really, really easily, right? Why don't we do the glossary first now, right? So I'll submit this, right? And I'll create a glossary report here. And then I'll actually do the other one in the same go, right? I'll unselect this one and say, okay, why don't we do this as an attribute verification over here, right? So now I have two reports, and just for fun, I'll create one big one as well, just so we can look at that very easily as well, right? So this is going to be the one that I already had generated before, and I'm overwriting with this step. Right, so what I'm doing now is I'll go and take a look at what this looks like, right? So let's open these files, right? So here we have the glossary report. Let's start with that one, right? And you see that actually what we have here is a lot of invalid terms reports. Why is that? Because some of the terms that I had defined over here, right, are actually not present in either the glossary or the data model. Right, so I would probably want to, modify this a little bit in a real-world situation. But you also see that there are two synonyms exceptions here, right, which are actually the ones that we will see over here, right, the email-related ones, right. So you see them clearly highlighted over there. So that's already great. We'll see those over there. So I'm going to open the attribute verification file here, right, which is the one that I've verified against this file over here, and where I've actually indicated that an email is mandatorily required, right? It has to be a string of length 100. Well, in the verification, it seems like we have found a number of issues here, right? Like, for example, here, this one here means that the attribute required rule was not validated. Same thing over here, right? So this one is actually the one that we have found in the, let me just verify this. So this one is in the employees entity, and the other ones are in the customers entity, right? And then we have a couple of other rules, right? Invalid length and invalid data type, right? Let's take a look here, right? Yes, indeed, right? So this one actually has the right data type and the right length and all of that, but it actually doesn't have the required box ticked, right? So that needs to be fixed here. And the other one over here is the wrong data type, the wrong, it hasn't got the mandatory requirement here, doesn't have the length, obviously, so I really need to do quite a bit of fixing here and make this an email of 100 and also make it mandatory, right, before I would satisfy these rules. Right, so if I run that report again, I should have a much better result. So let's do that. Let's run this report again, or this verification again, right? Verify the data model just for the attributes, and I'm going to save this as a V2, right? Replace the previous one, right? And now open that V2 report. Let's see what happens here. And yes, indeed, it's actually empty because I have fixed these verification issues that I had over here. Great. With that, I'm going to wrap up this little demo, and then we can transition to finalizing this tutorial. That concludes our short little demo here for the model verification features in Hackalate Studio. Obviously, highly recommend you to take a look at our online documentation. There's a very elaborate description of all the functionalities there and everything that you've heard about in this tutorial. Please also take a look at the blog and the excellent book that we created together with our friends at MongoDB and Steve Hoberman on MongoDB data modeling and schema design. And always stay in touch with our LinkedIn page and our Twitter page. And if you want to try the product, then a general reminder that the Hacklate Studio is downloadable for free, no credit card asked, and you can take it for a spin at any point. That's it. Thank you for paying attention. Any questions, please reach out. And otherwise, I will wish you a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.